so let's get started on this webinar. So we have a VITA family that owns VITA. They're the routers. This is really one of the last few dental businesses that are actually personally owned and not of a public corporation. This is good, really, because what we are concerned about always is that if we release any product, whether it's zirconia or ceramics or any millable materials, we thoroughly do a lot of testing prior to its being released. Now, that also means that maybe we release later on than we would like for the market. However, it's very rare. In fact, I've been here almost 15 years, and I can't remember where we actually had to take a product back off the market or relabel it to make it sound like it's a new product, yet it's the same, just because we got rid of any issues. So the routers are really concerned about providing the customer, you, and the patient with the most respected, consistent, and reliable materials on the market. They are located in Germany, and they have been in the CAD/CAM business in general since 1985. VITA was the first to coin a gold standard for machinables. We did this with the feldspathic block back in 1985, and we've come a long way producing, manufacturing different types of materials, and really materials that meet different indications, which is important. So when we talk about zirconia, just like we do any other product for the patient, you have to look at the aspect of what is the indication. What are we trying to achieve? And especially true with zirconia. Zirconia has a lot of different materials on the market, and they each have respective translucency or opacity. So if you don't understand your zirconia, you may select a zirconia that's not really for that indication that you have. So here's an example that we often run into. Someone will process a zirconia on the left-hand side. This is a non-glazed, out of the sintering furnace, A1 zirconia crown. It's an extra translucent. And then you have the shade tab, and then you have the A1 glaze. Now, what you need to keep in mind that when it comes to zirconia, depending on the opacity, translucency level, it will look different compared to the shade tab. But this is because your shade tabs are produced out of a ceramic material, a layered metal ceramic material from VITA. So if you were to select a dye, a prep, which all crowns are going to go onto the prep, of course, and you've got that underlying prep shade. Once you add that prep shade, all of a sudden it darkens up. It becomes more chromatized, if you will. So then the A1 actually looks like an A1. So remember, outside the box, after it's been sintered, don't compare your shades at that time. You have to take into account the underlying prep shade as well. So take a shade, make sure that you get a shade even for zirconia, especially in the anterior where the aesthetics is important, and you're going to select a zirconia that has a high degree of translucency. You may find that your prep shade is so dark that if the doctor, if you're prescribed an A1, you may have to go to a bleach zirconia to make that lighten up, to diffuse that discolored preparation. In some cases, the dentist also has to mask out the prep as well if it's severely discolored. So at the end of the day, if you are looking at zirconia, you should have, after you sinter it and after you have a preparation color background, you should achieve the shades that match the shade guide or shade tabs individually that VITA produces if you're getting VITA materials. Of course, this is really only conforms to VITA shade, VITA materials. We've done a lengthy study, took us a long time to come out with a ST, which is super translucent, or an XT, which is an extra translucent zirconia that is comes out and is aligned with each shade tab that we produce. So this is achievable, and you can get some really good results. So again, when you compare it to a shade tab itself from VITA, these are 4 millimeters thick. They are actually produced out of a metal, specialized metal ceramic. So when you compare it to a zirconia without a prep shade in there, a pseudo prep, then you have to create one to produce the shade that you're looking for, because the zirconia is going to show right through. This would be how you could make a pseudo prep. Once you have the shade, just get some of your old composites, indirect composites, if you will, and create a dye into your milled restorations, whether it's zirconia or any other feldspathic, if it's a VITA blocks or a saprinity and so forth, or even enamic. Once you create this, then you can manipulate your zirconia much better, and you'll also have the proper shade that you're really reviewing. Now, zirconia is driven by the patient, right? What are the indications for that specific patient? So, like all manufacturers, we have several types of translucent materials, and it goes from the original zirconia, which we called it at the time translucent, and then that had a light transmission level, if you will, or a translucency of about 32%. But today, because of the high aesthetic demands and monolithic restorations dominating the market, we go all the way up to about a 50%. So you can see here from a T, we can increase the translucency all the way up to 36%. Now, when you increase the translucency, not for all manufacturers, because some manufacturers produce their zirconia with some tinting colors to increase the optical properties to make it more translucent or appear translucent, we kind of compromise on the strength. So we lower the zirconia, which is the strength factor of zirconia, and the companies, what we do is we add some yttria, a little bit more yttria, and that adds an additional grain size, if you will, that increases the translucency. So you have to understand what restoration, what indication, and match it up to what the patient's requirements are for that particular restoration. So here's a schematic, if you will. So if you're going to do a staining or a cutback or layering, you're going to need different zirconia translucencies for the different types of materials. So what you use for a monolithic zirconia restoration, the translucency may be higher than maybe something that you're going to do a cutback. And this posterior cutback here is going to be different translucency than if you were to produce a anterior, right? So if you're really looking for optimal aesthetics on the anterior, you need some good translucency. We always fight for room on anteriors, even though we're going to add some translucent porcelain. You want that light transmission to go through and to appear better as far as the translucency goes. If you're going to layer porcelain, then you need a whole different type of zirconia. There's no reason to get the expense and the high translucency of zirconia if you're going to layer your porcelain onto the frameworks. It may not be necessary. Same with pressing. You can use zirconia, of course, to press, or press over, I should say. So that zirconia, you're looking more for a opacious dentin look. So you have lower translucency. So maybe you use a high translucent or a translucent that has minimal translucency and maximizes opacity. Some of these large cases that we do, you kind of need a combination of both. So maybe the in-between, you won't go with the highest translucent, but you'd want to go with the one below that that's super translucent, because you're still going to apply maybe some veneering, especially when it comes to the pink tissue and so forth. That whole framework has to be strong. So you have to move away from a high translucency that has a weaker flexural strength and move into something that's appropriate, that has the right translucency and appropriate for anything over a 4-unit bridge and so forth. You may even select a zirconia that is very opacious because of the patient's indication, right? These have translucency. You can see these on the upper anteriors, but when it comes to the lowers and the actual fit, right, the actual where we blend it in with the rest of the dentition, you may need to manipulate and have your zirconia the right translucency and the right coloring to make it blend in, just like you were if you were doing ceramics as well. So again, sometimes the price of translucency is possibly the strength. All of our materials meet all of the appropriate standards. So your XT is for anything for a 3-unit bridge or smaller, because it is so translucent. Your ST is more for any bridge that is greater than 4 or greater units. You can do full arches with this material. And then, of course, the original THT, which were the older school type zirconia, that's more for layering, if you will. So one of the things we have to be careful on is the design, right? If you're doing bridges, especially now that we're doing larger and larger fixed type zirconia bridges, we have to make sure that the connector is correct. Now, we all use the design parameters in our CAM, in our CAD, and our design software, but we have a tendency to start grinding them down because we're looking to provide teeth, and some of these zirconias, we have a hard time to imagine the contours exact how we mill them, and we want to go through that interproximal and kind of do those contours a little bit more. But you have to be careful because you can get fracturing, breakage, even on full contour stuff down the road if you're not careful, if you don't adhere to those design parameters. So make sure you don't go in there and undersize those connectors. Try to not touch those connectors. If you do, then you want to, in the design parameter, you want to make sure that you bulk it up a little. Now, this is where also some of us are compartmentalized, right? We are either in the design side of the business, or we are in the production, contouring, polishing type of the department. I recommend that these two departments, the design and the actual finishing part, that they need to get together. They need to routinely get together. The CAD person, the designer, they actually need to get and sit down with the technician that has to deal with the finishing of these frameworks and say, hey, for this particular case, I had to grind here. For this particular case, hey, it was perfect. So if you're only doing design on a screen, it's difficult for that person to really visualize and understand how they can become better and more efficient for the entire company, the process, the workflow, if they design a little bit better. Because if they have to end up grinding into these frameworks, then you're starting to really gouge into these connectors, and you're really setting up yourself, the whole company, everyone, for a failure. So be careful of that. You have to design. The designer needs to understand, of course, support, things of that nature. We need to make sure that we have the framework to support what we're trying to do. They're not always thimbles. When it comes to milling, on the milling side, like all companies, we have what are called milling strategies that are specific to the material. So what we produce has a different milling strategy compared to somebody else's zirconia. So a lot of us have a cam that we can input and adjust the milling strategies. So if that's possible, you want to optimize, ensure that your milling unit is optimized in the milling strategy area to efficiently mill these restorations. Our zirconia, the VITA Zirconia, is a very dense material. It mills really fine to thin cross sections. It's dense for a reason, so that the marginal integrity, you don't have a lot of flakes or chipping at the margins. It has to be able to mill very thin, down to 2/3 of a millimeter at the margin, because then it shrinks and it becomes 25% smaller. So there are some defaults in your system that allow you to mill, but just optimize your milling strategy. Make sure you can contact us. These are online on our website that you can actually download and then use these parameters for your milling strategy. Now, other areas, you want to make sure that when you clamp these discs, right, these even zirconia, it's fairly strong in its kind of quasi pre-sintered form. But if you over stress discs, no matter what the disc is, who made it, you can create fractures. So make sure that you tighten your screws to just a firm level. Don't over tighten. This is almost like a car replacing a tire with the lug nuts, right? You want to make sure that you tighten all three or whatever the screws you have. You want to offset them, so you tighten one and then tighten the other to a snug fit, and just make sure that they're all at the same pressure so you don't have issues. So when it comes to the post milling process, so you've got your zirconia, it's been milled out. You need to use the correct instruments so that you don't introduce any foreign material that will not sinter out during the sintering process. In other words, it won't burn out. It's like anything else we do in the dental world. When we process things and we put them in the furnaces, or we invest them and cast them, there are certain contaminants that if you introduce, you're going to have an issue with the outcome. So avoid that. Use the wheels that are specific for sintering. There's these wheels. They're almost like a nylon wheel that really smooths out the zirconia as well. You use a diamond. It's possible to use a diamond or a carbide to adjust these if you need to remove the sprues. You can use certain rubber wheels as long as they are specific for zirconia. If you are going to pre-color any zirconia before you sinter it, you need to make sure that you don't use your fingers, or you want to use your gloves. Is really what I'm saying. You can use your fingers, of course, we have to, but use gloves. But don't put your fingers directly on the object, on the framework. It will create oils, and if you don't end up cleaning the zirconia prior to the processing, if you go to soak the colorant into it, it will not penetrate, and you will end up with zirconia that has some real chromatic effects that you placed, and then other areas are going to be very light because the colorant just didn't penetrate inside the zirconia. So make sure everything is smooth and not clogged if you're going to introduce a colorant. Now, those of you, we do two ways of processing zirconia today. We either wet mill it if you've got a mill that wets, uses a water source as it's milling. Those are usually used with diamond burrs. And then we have the carbides where the zirconia is milled dry. They're handled two different ways. So if it's wet milled, you can't introduce it into a sintering furnace when it's wet. You will end up with an explosion, if you will, fireworks of your zirconia, because that inside liquid has nowhere. It'll give you a heat tear, just like we do with ceramics. It'll create a heat tear, but because of the zirconia is so dense, it has nowhere really to escape fast out. So it will kind of blow out. So if it's wet milled, you want to do a clean firing to get rid of all the oil residue, as well as dry it out. You can see on the temperature, this is what we recommend. There are other recommendations from different manufacturers, but we kind of have this parameter set, and it seemed to work well to get rid of all that liquid and so forth. Now, once it's dry, let's say you're going to need to pre-shade it. So you have two methods. You can either submerge it, right? If you submerge it, you can pick up a lot of color, but it's going to be uniform. It's going to be inside, outside, from gingival, cervical to incisal or occlusal. It'll all be the same chromatic effect. These are usually, the submersion technique is generally used now for the layering technique of zirconia, because you want an underlying framework that might be the same shade. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't partially submerge your zirconia frameworks into the liquid, let it soak up, and then go to a different color, and then submerge it to that level to create different levels of chroma effect from the cervical to the occlusal. But it takes a lot of time. Interesting enough, again, zirconia is kind of like a circuit cube is how I look at it. So the more you absorb it, leave it in for a minute, it will penetrate and go on a framework, usually go through all the way. On Ponix, it penetrates usually about 1 millimeter thick if you leave it in there for a minute. Now, the other technique that we're more prone to use today is the brushing technique. So the brushing technique is maybe a little bit more lengthier, but it allows you to fully characterize your zirconia frameworks. So make sure you use a brush, and whatever it is, the brush or the instrument or whatever you're using needs to be metal free. All right, so the end of this, the ferrule of their brush needs to be non-metallic. Our zirconia shading liquids are in fact a water-based material. So there's not a lot of reaction with metal, but however, all colorants have some sort of oxide that may react with the metal. So you don't want to mix your colorants with water. You don't want to use instruments made out of metal. You want to also make sure that, unless you're looking for the effect, that when you apply your colorant, you're going to do the edge of the margin as well. Otherwise, underneath, at the margin end, you're going to have a very white halo. So unless you are looking for that, make sure that you color inside the restoration as well. I'm going to check, see if there's any questions. I don't see any at this time. So make sure you do yourself a favor. Make sure you do the margins for sure, okay, at the end. All right, so when it comes to coloring, you can use those brushes, Metalist. We also use, or I also use these, I just get them off of eBay or from Amazon. Everything's from Amazon. But they do make different, like, watering, coloring applicators. And these are very useful. You can fill them up with whatever color, just label them, and then you can just start coloring the way you want. They're very useful if you don't have the right brush size. Some of these smaller brushes you can use to make very fine, detailed characterizations. The coloring itself, we offer pink. You have to use a pink if you're going to add pink porcelain. A lot of these white, pink fixed restorations, if your zirconia doesn't have an underlying pinkish to it without making it a gray or a purple, the pink itself is basically like an opaque for zirconia for the gingiva areas. It begins the process, it begins the aesthetics, it begins the transitional look of soft or pink tissue gingiva. So make sure you use the pink accordingly. There are several pinks that are available, so you can actually mix and match if you want to make a lighter or a darker tone of pink if you want. The blues are usually used for depth in the occlusal area, the cuss tips, the incisal areas. Just like a blue ceramic stain would be used, this is how you would use the blue. And then the gray also, blue and gray both will provide a translucency. The gray gives you a little bit more depth, if you will, because of it's a little bit more on the blackish side, of course. And then you have different colors as well available. The browns or the oranges that maybe around the cervical area you're going to apply because you need that very high chromatic effect. So at the end, it should come out where you have a very nice polychromatic or monochromatic, whichever the indication is, of the restorations if you color it. You can see here, I like this picture because one thing I wanted to point out is this is an effect on the lingual here, this whitish, where there wasn't enough colorant added, or the fact that maybe there's some oil there that the technician didn't really recognize, and it prevented the colorant from penetrating into the zirconia. But either way, what I often use is, because I know zirconia is fairly whitish, no matter what, if it's a pre-shaded or a multicolor, that if you don't add, especially around the cuss tips, there are some patients that require a whitish, frosty look on the cuss. Just don't add a lot of colorant to it, or don't use any colorant if it's pre-shaded. But you can manipulate the zirconia and make it the way that you want for the patient's indication. There may be many cases that you're not going to use pre-shaded zirconia, that you're going to use white specifically to match what the patient's needs are. So keep that in mind. Like everyone, we have kind of a baseline, if you will. It's how many licks of the lollipop. We often get this question, well, how many times do I brush the colorant onto the zirconia? Well, it's a factor of how thick the zirconia is, what kind of instrument you're using to apply it. Is it a ponic or is it a thinner material, right? So in general, what you want to do is add just enough to create your effect. We give guidelines. You can always, on these where you're doing it in thirds if you want, you can always mark where you want. Just use a pencil that will burn out at high temperature. You know, you want to rinse the brush before you go into a different color or chroma effect. So you rinse it with water, but then you dry that out. You want to remove as much water out of that as you can. Make sure you use distilled water. I already talked about the whitish cuss tips. And then once everything's all done, you have the characterization that you want, right? You have two ways to dry these. It's either under a infrared lamp or through the furnace. So it has to be pre-dried as well, and I'll get into that. Cervical areas, again, you know, there's all sorts of chroma effects, the orange, the brown, colors, as well as chromatized, really intense chroma for cervical effects, and occlusal anatomy as well. Now, if you're not sure what the colorant is going to do, when we mill zirconia on us that we, you know, mill a lot of discs, you'll have a lot of pieces left. So what you want to use is, if you have some white, non-shaded or shaded, you know, you can cut out some of these areas. And then once they're out, you just use a sandpaper and create some discs, or create a little bit of thin cross sections that which then you color, and then you can sinter along with your other stuff. Sinter it, and then you'll have what the effect truly is. And then if you make these, you can tape them on a cardboard, or however you want to do it. Tape them to a piece of paper. But you can actually say, hey, at 1 millimeter cross sections using this colorant, this is the effect. If you're going to layer it and you want an underlying characterization and internal color, you can do that the same way and just label it as such. But don't waste all your zirconia pieces. These are very useful for all sorts of different things. All right, so when we go back to drying them, when you color them, it's just like wet milling them. You have introduced a liquid, a water, a material that has to be dispersed before it goes into the high temperature of sintering. Again, if you don't, it is going to blow up just like before. So if you want the perfect shades and you want your restorations to come out the way you colored them, you pre-dry it with either infrared or that you use the furnace. Now, this is an example of colorants that, you know, when you use it, you want to, it might help you achieve the right shade as far as the shade tap goes. So using the colorant, it will enhance some of the color as well. And when I say color, we actually have liquids that are for, you know, A1, A2, A3, and so forth. So you can actually create the color and make it a little bit more aligned with the shade tab. Now, here's where we use the sintering furnace, or you can use a conventional ceramic furnace that you can pre-dry it, okay? But when it comes to sintering, after you're ready to throw it up, zirconia does not sinter at the same temperature across the board. Yeah, everyone has to understand that each manufacturer of the zirconia has different firing temperatures in sintering to optimize that translucency level. So even our own, we don't sinter all at the same temperature. And the reason is because it's got different types of composition as far as zirconia and the and yttria. Okay, so we have to fire sinter each zirconia according to its compositional matrix and what the manufacturer says. So it's different from a 32% translucent material and a 50% translucent material. Now, I threw this in because often we get calls and say, hey, so what is this mole thing, right? Well, the mole itself is really the amount of yttria that is increased, if you will, compared to the zirconia. So as we decrease zirconia, right, we can increase the yttria. And when we call like it's a 3 mole, 4 mole, 5 mole, it's dependent on how much yttria has been added to it. So that's what the mole is. So we don't, we often, even dentists ask about it every once in a while. We also have to make sure, like I mentioned, that, we get calls that say, well, I have this certain zirconia or whatever, or certain sintering furnace, and you know what, I just throw everything in at the same temperature. I want more translucent zirconia, so I'm going to increase the temperature. By increasing the temperature on the sintering, you do have an enlargement of grain size, which allows more light transmission, so it will be more translucent. That is true. However, it really doesn't work that way as far as strength. You've compromised the actual material that it's based on. So you probably have about a 20, 25 degree high-low before things get out of whack. But you have to make sure that you follow the instructions again. So our zirconia, depending on the type and the translucency level, again, we sinter it different because we want to maximize the crystal growth. So certain compositions of zirconia require a certain temperature to optimize the grain size and to ensure that the grain boundaries are sufficient to allow the light penetration and diffraction of light so that it looks translucent. So if you go too high on any particular material, it does give you a slight increase of translucency, but the strength is compromised. It's decreased. So be careful when you think all zirconia should be sintered at the same temperature. They're not. Of course, we have all these temperatures. We have, for certain materials, we can speed cycle. We can do the T and the HT in an 80-minute cycle even. But the really translucent material, it takes time to mature in the sintering furnace. So those are long-term, slow heat. The XT, the most translucent we have, it's all the way down to 4 degrees per minute increase. And then these cool down, and it doesn't open up. You don't open your furnace up until it reaches about 200 degrees Celsius. So adhere to the instructions. Not everything can be speed cycled. In a ceramic furnace, we certainly have the ability to silver test or do clean firing. But what do we do about a sintering furnace, right? Because on a ceramic furnace, if you see things like this, you know that, if these are supposed to be clear, we know we have to do something. But if your result is coming out where it's discolored, it's time to really look at your heating elements. So on the left here, you see all these white spots and burn spots? This is due to never cleaning your sintering furnace. You're constantly using sintering stuff with it inside during the operations. You're never letting it to cycle with nothing in it, which is like a healing process, if you will. And you can have some really nasty looking elements in there if you use them too long and you don't recycle your sintering furnace to kind of clean it. And by cleaning it without anything inside the sintering process, what you're trying to do is shake off all those oxides, all that material that's collected on this, and try to refinish it. You actually have microfractures inside these used elements, and by doing a clean cycle, you actually end up where these elements, the material will actually kind of heal, and the micro cracks will get smaller, and then therefore you got a longer length lifespan of your sintering furnace. So if they're contaminated, if you see that, you have to do that clean firing. If your beads become cracked and they're yellowish, you need to remove those and replace them, right? If you're going to do a clean firing, what you can do, if you take those little pieces from a white, non-shaded zirconia, you can place them in your firing tray and go through the cleaning firing, okay? And that helps, sometimes it helps absorb any of those oxides and any of that material that's floating around in your muffle as it really heats up. So we just use a temperature of about 1500 degrees. This is actually built into our furnace, but if you need more information on that, I'm glad to provide that to you. And when you get rid of your beads, don't throw them away. Put them in a baggie, right? And then you can use them later, all right? Because if you're walking around with a dish full of beads, and somebody actually trips me and I spill all the beads, those are all contaminated from dirt and so forth. So you don't want to use those, but as a backup, you can always use those older beads and then order new ones as needed. When it comes to the sintering process itself, you want to make sure you lay them down correctly, usually with the margins sitting up. What's very important is these large fixed bridges that usually have support frames. That has to stay intact, and then you have to make sure that you lay it in your sintering furnace correctly. The purpose of a lot of this is, with the beads and laying them correctly, is that you're not dragging the margins or dragging critical areas in which during the sintering process, as it shrinks, the beads allow it to roll smoothly. And the beads, usually I would put no more than 3 layers. Some only use 2, which is fine. I wouldn't use 1 because that then sets it up where it might drag on the material of the firing tray itself. So use 2 or 3 layers. That's it. That's all you need. If you're going to do some sintering with some colorant, you can use your trays, collect them upside down. Set them upside down so that they collect any of the colorant gas to help protect the elements, to lengthen the lifespan of those. You can double stack, of course. But when you double stack compared to a single stack, if you double stack and you fully load your sintering furnace, just like cooking a chicken, the time it takes to cook 1 chicken versus 6 in the oven may be different. So your firing temperatures may have to be reset as far as either the slow up the temperature increase, or increase the hold time, something to help stabilize and counteract the number of units. If you throw 80, 100 into a sintering furnace, they are going to look different than if you were to throw just 20 of them in there, right? Because they all absorb heat, and the heat is no longer really uniform on all types of the restorations. So make sure you do that, especially if you have bridges as well. Ponic areas and frameworks, they're going to absorb more heat than they should, and so forth. Let's say you come out with a restoration, you're not sure that it is shaded properly. Most sintering furnaces on the market, including ours, ours really it self-calibrates in the sense that it checks all of the parameters, make sure everything's functioning correctly. But if you happen to have a case in which you feel that your furnace is not achieving the right temperature, on the ceramic furnace, we have a silver test you can use. On the sintering furnace, there is a company, it's called Ferro. There's a company that actually makes zirconia sintering rings that when you sinter them at a specific temperature. You just measure them. You do this like 3 different times, and then there's a calculation, and it'll tell you precisely on your sintering furnace what temperature it's achieving, and then you can adjust it in your global settings as well. Once things are sintered, you got to be careful, especially if you're going to add ceramics to it. Monolithic, this isn't that important, but anything you're going to add ceramics to, you need to make sure you're careful on grinding so that you don't overgrind, overheat, and change that type of crystalline structure, the grain, to a monoclinic structure out of the tetragonals, right? So you want to make sure that the surface is correct for layering. And to do this, if you grind on it, you always want to do a regeneration cycle. And if you're one that receives outsource, right? If you are delivered any zirconia that you're not sure and you have not worked with the outsource lab, whether they've adjusted or not, you should always redo the frameworks first and do this regeneration firing so that you condition the surface conducive to layering, okay? Layering itself is just like anything else. If you want to create a zirconia framework, micro layer it, whatever. We actually have 2 different ceramics out there that can be used, applied to zirconia. When we add ceramics, though, we want to make sure that we decrease the ramp, the rate. We want to reduce that. The larger the case is, we want to reduce it down to maybe even 40 degrees per minute. Some people even go to 35. But we understand now that zirconia has a very slow heating and cooling curve. So we have to adjust the heat rate. The bigger the case, the slower we go on the heat rate, and then a slow cool. And those of you that are aware of ceramics and furnaces, right? When we talk about slow cool, we're really talking about the muffle doesn't open until reaching 500 degrees on porcelain, if it's layered to zirconia. Okay, so that's a slow cool. It can't open. Once you have your zirconia and it's ready to go, monolithic or not, you then go to polishing glaze. We recommend you always polish monolithic zirconia. These zirconia frameworks are made out of large grains that may lead to more abrasion against the antagonist. This is something that's really still controversial in the market, in the dental market. But from our standpoint, what we want is that if the patient wears through the glaze, which there are, just in general, there are studies that show, that might happen within 2 to 3 years to wear through the glaze. Once they start coming in contact with the direct zirconia, that should be a polished surface. So if your dentists are adjusting and they're adjusting properly before they let the patient go, they want to make sure that they repolish that zirconia if they can. Okay. The polishing itself, some polishers are more unique to zirconia than not. Some polishers, they'll leave you that iridescent look. The zirconia, Sintering type polishers that we have, they really reduce that look. But you do have to polish no matter what. Please polish your zirconia if it's going to be monolithic. The stained glaze, right? You're always trying to use a low fusing universal type glaze system that's compatible with many products. Our Accent Plus is like a universal material. It comes in different colors, just like everyone else. But ours does offer, unless it's a little black or something, they do offer a high degree of fluorescence as well. So if you have a situation where you have a zirconia, the shade is slightly off, you can always go back and use a stain colorant. We actually make now a stain specific to A group, B group, C group, and D group, where you just use a little bit. These are called chroma stains. And this will add just a hint of that shade and bring it back into alignment with the shade. Because after all, right, most patients aren't exactly A1, exactly A2. Maybe they're A.2.5, right? A little bit more. So these chroma effect stains, that's what that's for, to add just a little bit of more chroma to make it look more like the appropriate shade. You can always add your glaze with your stain. We have finishing agent as well. They're basically porcelains, low fusing porcelains that you can add to your stains. That'll mimic some of your satin, silky look if you want. And then also the stains are added, or the glaze is added, to recreate that fluorescence, because most zirconias are dead. You know, they have very limited light transmission, and especially in the fluorescence area, they are very dark. So that's why we would use a stain glaze, or even sometimes it's needed to add a specific glaze called something like flow glaze that we have, specific to the zirconia to increase that fluorescence. So that's available as well. So if you have someone who says, hey, looks nice, but the patient's concerned about the zirconia, it doesn't look as fluorescent as it should, you may need to go to a fluorescent type glaze and use that. But we just add it, we spray it, we brush it on. We recommend that you go if it's pre-colored for sure, but we only recommend going up to about 850 on the glazing cycle. This is just to ensure a nice wet, and also if it's pre-colored, you don't want to start burning out the colorant, the oxide colorants that are in your zirconia. So we basically use a low fusing type glaze. The other things that you want to do is just make sure you communicate to your dentist that we have a milling machine, right, that we can mill some of this stuff, but is the doctor preparing that tooth restoration correct, right? So you don't want to have the doctor give you a millimeter of thickness for material thickness, and then your burrs, when you mill this, where that you over mill it, right? Because the doctor didn't round out those line angles and things. So make sure you communicate what's the smallest size burr that you use, and accordingly, what's the sharpest angle that you can get away with without having to over mill. It's very important. But when it comes to zirconia shading, right, taking it to the next level, using the right zirconia to start with, the right canvas, the right translucency, the right opacity for that patient indication, right? If you get off, you get up the bat and you bat and you get off the base and you can get a home run if you're going to first and rounding it correctly, going to second, third, and then getting it home. As long as you're following the right rules, regulations, you're manipulating the materials that you have out of your toolbox correctly, and you're shading things correct, you have no reason not to be able to produce some very high-end aesthetic material out of zirconia that looks very natural, okay? Whether it's pink gingiva or the white itself. So I hope everyone learned something from this. The videos, the webinars that we do, the VITA learning materials that we post on the YouTube, VITA North America YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. Please check us out. You can always learn some more. We are always here to help you and work with you on any types of subject matter or product use and so forth. So you can always give us a call or email us. At this time, does anybody have any open questions? If you do, you have a question box that you can throw me a question. If you do, please do so though now. Anything that you might be interested in, or anything that maybe I covered, I went too fast, or so forth. We have one question, and it goes back to why glaze at a low temperature. Well, we glaze at a lower temperature twofold. One is that we don't want to disrupt the surface, if you will, of zirconia. Because of those large grain sizes, we do a lower temperature because it flashes a little bit thinner, and it makes sure that it absorbs in, if you will, in between these microscopic grain boundaries. And then the other thing, of course, is that with zirconia, if you have a pre-shaded or you're using the colorant, if you burn out too many times at a high level, the oxide, the pigments will actually start burning out as well. Let's see here. We have a question from Margaret. Margaret, you recommend, let's see here. Let me make sure I read it correctly. Margaret, if I can get out of this. Where'd you go? Well, let me go back to, again, Galena has a question. What was the high temperature for reconditioning zirconia? If you're going to recondition it, that's 1,000 degrees for 15 minutes or so. That will be a good temperature in which you're going to restructure your zirconia so that you have a nice surface that is going to be conducive for porcelain layering. And then we have one from Jean. It's the VITA YZ Cam is 3 mol. That is correct. The HT, the T and the HT are both a 3 mol. So that's the older style zirconia. So we have the ST, which is 4, and an XT, which is 5. So it's based on, again, on that translucency. How do you choose between blue and gray? So Todd, there's a question from Todd. Really, I prefer the blue, but others never use the blue and just use the gray. Well, but what you can use these colors for is, if you see in this background here, you can do contrast. So between the blue and the gray, generally end up using both. A little bit less gray, but more blue. But they're used more of a contrast as well. The gray is going to provide you with more depth. The blue is going to give you a little bit more, what I would consider more translucency, if you will. Margaret, the low temperature accent glaze have the same fluorescence as accent plus glaze. So they do have the same fluorescence between our low temperature and our high standard temperature glaze. Those are the same. However, specific to zirconia, it really requires even a higher degree of fluorescence to penetrate and stay with that zirconia for the end result. So we had to, like other people maybe as well, we had to come out with a specialized fluorescent glaze, a low temperature one, for zirconia. It is kind of really aligned to provide that zirconia with a very nice fluorescence. Also, how does VM9 affect the zirconia color if fired at proper temperature? So your zirconia and your VM9 or Lumex AC, which is also what we have, the layering portions for the zirconia, those are no different than any other ceramics, if you will. If you want to affect the color of zirconia, for instance, let's say you're layering a framework, and your framework is A1 or A3, it doesn't really matter. But if you need an underlying more warmth, more effect inside the layering, maybe you go to a more stronger chroma type porcelain and lay that down first, and then you come back with your shaded porcelain and your enamel effects. So that's a good question, but you have a lot of materials to manipulate zirconia. Let's see here. We have a question from let's see, Samadin, and you recommend 13 coats? No, I think you're talking about glaze or the colorant, either one. I really is not all full coverage. Every zirconia disc has different contraction ratio. Will a lower contraction ratio be more accurate than a higher ratio disc? No. Well, the density matters because you get a better mill out of something like a VITA manufactured disc because it's really dense. It optimizes your milling strategy. But as far as the sintering or shrinkage, the enlargement factor, some of you use that term, that in itself really doesn't matter. It's more of the quality of the outcome. Does your bridge rock? Does your margins fit well? And things of that nature. Margaret, again, let's see. You recommend, Kirsten, do you paint over several times for each color, use more than saturation? You do. So when you look at a tooth, like we all do, right? A cervical, middle, incisal, or occlusal, we know we have usually more chroma down by the cervical. So we would add maybe an extra brush stroke or two to make sure that that has that chromatic effect. And then whatever that is that you stop at, 4, for instance, then on the middle third, maybe you're only doing 3. And then when it comes to the occlusal and incisal, you're only doing 1 or 2. And that way you have a multi-layered, multi-chromatic effect and so forth. Now, as I suggested, if you have spare pieces of zirconia, sand those down to a small disc, flat disc, and color and try those out. It really will help you understand and manipulate the colors much better. Is there a problem with the, okay, I don't see that. All right, any other questions? We look like we're out of questions. So if there's anything else, certainly give us a call here at the office. And I hope you enjoyed the webinar. We are doing these just about every week. We have a series going on now, even with Peter Peasy. It's every Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. It'll be the series 2 out of a series of 4. However, they're all standalone. So if you miss webinar 1 with Peter, that's on our website. That is on our YouTube channel. Next week is another one, and then we have 2 more after that. But we have videos, we have webinars, all sorts of educational materials, resources that you can tap into at our site. So I hope you do that. And I thank you very much for coming to the education, the learning channel of VITA, spending your time here.